Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing alright in the second lockdown and still coping. We are almost halfway through, hopefully, so perhaps not too bad if you think of it like that. And I hope you're not missing Theatre Society too much. So we're going to try and find ways to compensate for the lack of in-person sessions, and these videos will be one of the ways that we're going to publish this Monday and the next 2 Mondays, and then hopefully have a virtual session on Wednesday to link to the video from the Monday. So we're going to be looking at a specific technique and practitioner that we would have looked at in the in-person session this week had we been able to meet physically. And that particular technique is that of epic theatre. Now this was a technique that was coined by the German practitioner Bertolt Brecht, who lived in the 20th century during the latter part of the century and the mid to latter part of the century. Now, his ideas were very much in contrast to the naturalism that we've already looked at, whereby it's about being as realistic as possible and portraying everyday life. Brecht was very much in the opposite of this, because he wanted the audience to think about the message that was being portrayed in the play, rather than get too emotionally invested in the characters. So, whilst we may have looked a few weeks ago at Meisner, and you could also look at Stanislavski, for example, and their techniques are about using emotions to try and make your character as realistic as possible as what you would see in daily life, and also make the set and the technical side of the play as realistic as possible. Brecht, on the other hand, wanted the audience to think about the meaning of the play rather than the characters, and he used various techniques to avoid the audience getting too emotionally invested in the characters, because he felt that that would lead to losing sight of the actual meaning of the play. And the reason for this is that a lot of Brecht's plays were very political. He was a Marxist, and he wanted the audience to consider the meaning of the play, so he avoided such naturalistic techniques to ensure that the audience would consider what the message was. What he wanted, rather, was that the audience would not have to suspend their disbelief when going and watching one of his plays. So if you were to go and watch a naturalistic play, you would suspend your disbelief in the sense that you would watch it believing it was realistic, and ignoring the fact that it's in a theatre. But Brecht didn't want that to happen. He wanted the audience to be fully aware that it is simply a play in a theatre. So the techniques that he used were very interesting and very much a contrasting style to a lot of modern theatre, a lot of what we've looked at, but it's very important to understand these techniques because they've been highly influential on work since, and later we can consider whether you think these techniques might be better, might be more effective, what are their pros and cons, compared with having an entirely naturalistic set and entirely naturalistic characters. So we're going to go through some of the techniques that Brecht would use in his work, and would want his characters to portray. And that wouldn't just be during his lifetime, but these traits continue to the modern day in some works. So in order to avoid the audience getting too emotionally invested in the characters, there were some ways that he would avoid this. And one of these ways is quite simply by breaking out of character. So in some of his plays, there would be a lot of narration, so breaking the fourth wall, and that immediately avoids the naturalistic sense because you're talking directly to the audience rather than being an entirely standard natural narrator or any of those techniques that would avoid being natural, avoid what would be seen in the real world. Another very interesting technique would be speaking the stage directions. Now this was mainly used in rehearsals rather than the actual performances, but it certainly is very unique, very interesting, that a character could be walking down across the stage and say how they're feeling. I'm feeling very sad, I'm feeling very emotional, I'm feeling very depressed, I'm angry. They would say these things rather than just portraying them through their performances, which is very much against what Stanislavski or Meisner thought, but it's certainly very interesting and very useful to be able to see these different techniques and think about how they would impact on the audience compared with an entirely natural character. Another way would be using placards. So, for example, the sets were very, very simplistic in Brecht's work because he wanted, again, to avoid the naturalism. So he would have, you might use a placard to say this is a car door or this is a suitcase, instead of actually having the actual item, because again, it has the same effects of making the audience aware that they're just watching a play, they're not watching real life. Other techniques would include multi-rolling, so characters again would have numerous different roles within the same piece. It would be a very simple cast, a very small cast, perhaps smaller than the number of parts that there are in the play, but this, again, this idea of kind of poor theatre, multi-rolling, very much is anti-naturalism because you aren't getting invested in one character. You might see the same person being several characters. But on the other side of the same coin, there might be split roles, in which sense there would be multiple people playing the same role. And then on the technical side, the props, the set, the lighting would all be as simplistic as possible. There would be no fancy technical lighting. There might just be standard stage lighting, and it might just be a normal room. And there would certainly not be very fancy sets. There might just be occasional props used, but as we said, we could use placards to replace a lot of these props in order to reinforce this idea that people are just watching a play. Because that's what he wanted. He didn't want people to get too emotionally invested in the characters. He wanted them to think about the meaning of the play. So those are some of the techniques that are used in epic theatre. But what is interesting would be to have a think about what you think of what I've just spoken about. So do you think these techniques in epic theatre would be more effective at portraying the message of a play, or do you think that naturalism that we looked at a few weeks ago would be better? In what circumstances do you think epic theatre could be more effective? Could it lend itself to a funny play? Could it lend itself to a more serious play? Could it lend itself to drama? Could it lend itself to comedy? There are many ways to think about how it could be used most effectively. As I say, in a lot of Brecht's plays it was very political, the content. Is that the only place in which it could be used? So have a think about what we've just looked at, and then we will be looking at doing a session on Wednesday, all being well, which will allow us to have a discussion about these techniques. You can bring your ideas, and then we might try and do some exercises as far as possible virtually. So we might look at a script or devise a mini piece and try and perform it naturalistically, and then perform it using epic theatre techniques and see which one you feel is most effective. Maybe you don't like the idea of epic theatre, maybe you think that plays should only be naturalistic. That's entirely up to you, but we're just looking at different ways of performing and seeing which ones you feel are most effective. So that's that from me. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and hopefully it's been very thought-provoking. If you've got any questions, feel free to put them on the group chat or send me a question, or anyone in the committee, and hopefully we will have a session on Wednesday when we can advance and have a discussion more about these techniques and even begin putting them into practice as far as is possible, of course, over Teams. Hope you have a good week, and thanks for watching.